Hi guys, my name is Shad again, and I'm here to teach the principles of physiology again this week. Today we're going to be focusing on something called the autonomic nervous system, which is the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. So first to begin, let's talk about just some different branches of our nervous system. So here on the board, I'll draw a little diagram. The nervous system is divided into a couple of different parts. We have our peripheral nervous system, and we have our autonomic nervous system. Oh, my bad, that's not right. We have our peripheral nervous system and our central nervous system. Jump the gun a little bit there. In the peripheral nervous system, this is going to subdivide into some further points. Also in the central nervous system, we'll subdivide into a couple points. Talk about the central nervous system first. In the central nervous system, this is just composed of your brain and your spinal cord. There's nothing else in your central nervous system. This is kind of like the control center. In our peripheral nervous system, this divides into our autonomic nervous system and the somatic nervous system. So over here is the autonomic nervous system. I'll abbreviate that with ANS, autonomic nervous system. And over here we have our somatic nervous system. So somatic nervous system. Coming off of the somatic nervous system, we have a couple of branches as well. From our somatic nervous system, we go to sensory neurons and motor neurons. So these are things that are involved in like touch reception, feeling sensations, and our muscles. Motor neurons help move our muscles. Skeletal muscles specifically. In the autonomic nervous system, this is going to branch off as well. We have the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. For the majority of this video, I'm going to be focusing on these two things, focusing on the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. This is kind of layout of the nervous system itself. So I'm going to erase this and go on to some other points. So, when we're thinking about our autonomic nervous system, these are neurons that are going to innervate smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. And so, there are two main divisions, like I talked about, the sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system. So, we have the sympathetic nervous system, abbreviated SNS, and parasympathetic nervous system, I'll abbreviate with PNS. But here, the sympathetic nervous system is our fight or flight response. The sympathetic nervous system is involved in increasing our heart rate, our blood pressure. This is also going to dilate our bronchioles, which is just opening up our lungs so that we can breathe better. If you just think of a situation as if you were being chased by a bear, this is your response to that. What would your body do in reaction to a situation that is a surprise situation or something in danger, this is what your body is going to do in response to those situations. And so another thing that I forgot to mention is we'll have a increase in our blood flow as we open up our blood vessels. And so this is going to be kind of what will happen in response to the flight or fight situations. When we talk about the sympathetic nervous system, we have neurons in the sympathetic nervous system. Those neurons go to different specific parts of our body. So there's 4 routes that the sympathetic nervous system has. And I'll talk about the first route now. The very first route of the sympathetic nervous system is we are going to start in the thoracic vertebrae, and we'll be on the lateral horn of the thoracic vertebrae. From there, we're going to take a preganglionic neuron. This neuron is myelinated, so as we talked about in our previous videos, this is going to have myelin on it. I'll just represent that with some circles there. This is going to go to the sympathetic chain ganglia. That's the point where this neuron is going to synapse. And it synapses there, and then we pick up at a postganglionic neuron. This postganglionic neuron is typically longer, and it is unmyelinated. And we call this first route, we're going to take a spinal nerve in the postganglionic neuron. So this postganglionic neuron, meaning after the part where it synapses, is going to be a spinal nerve. And spinal nerves innervate 3 very specific things. They innervate erector pili. These are the muscles on your arm that control like your hair, if they stand up or not. They're going to innervate sweat glands. And these will innervate one more thing. They will innervate your blood vessels. So, from the lateral horn of the thoracic vertebrae all the way to erector pili, sweat glands, and blood vessels is our first pathway. And that is taken through spinal nerves after the sympathetic chain ganglia. The second pathway that we're going to talk about has the same presynaptic scenario. So our presynaptic neuron, or preganglionic neuron, is going to be myelinated as well. It's going to be short. This is going to synapse at the sympathetic chain ganglia. The postsynaptic neuron is unmyelinated, and it is going to be called a sympathetic nerve. This sympathetic nerve innervates the organs above the diaphragm, so the organs of the thoracic cavity. So it'd be like your heart and lungs. So, route 2. Start at the lateral horn of the spinal column in the thoracic vertebrae, and we go through a postganglionic nerve called the sympathetic nerve, and we innervate at organs of the thoracic cavity. There's a third pathway that we want to know. This pathway, we start at the same spot, lateral horn of the spinal cord. The short preganglionic neuron. We're going to synapse at a new spot. We call this the collateral ganglia. So we pass through the sympathetic chain ganglia, and we go to a spot called the collateral ganglia. at the collateral ganglia will synapse to a postsynaptic neuron that is unmyelinated. And here, this is what we call a splanchnic nerve. Splanchnic nerve. This nerve goes to all the organs that are below the diaphragm, so organs of the abdominal cavity in your belly area. So organs like your stomach, organs like your large intestine, small intestine, that region. So we're going to innervate nerves of the abdominal, pelvic cavity. So the abdomen and pelvic regions of our bodies will be innervating the organs that lie in that area. So, quick recap. Third root, we start at the lateral horn of the thoracic vertebrae in the spinal column. We go through a myelinated preganglionic neuron that synapses at the collateral ganglia. We travel through a splanchnic nerve and get to the abdominal pelvic cavity. And we can go to any organ there. The fourth route that we're going to take is what we call this right here is going to start the same scenario, but we're going to go a little bit further this time to, this is going to be a myelinated pre-synaptic or preganglionic neuron. We're going to go into something called the terminal ganglia. At the terminal ganglia, we are going to innervate something that we call the adrenal medulla. So the adrenal medulla sits on top of the kidney. Here, we're going to have cells in the adrenal medulla. And these cells in the adrenal medulla act as a postsynaptic neuron here. So these are unmyelinated, but they themselves are going to release their neurotransmitters into the bloodstream. So here is our bloodstream. And what they typically release is epinephrine into the bloodstream. So just quick recap of this pathway. Start at the lateral horn of the spinal column still. We go and travel all the way to the terminal ganglia, and we synapse at the adrenal medulla. This is the adrenal medulla, sitting on top of the kidney. And then from the adrenal medulla, we release our neurotransmitters into the bloodstream. So this is a sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. We have two more divisions I want to talk about. First, we'll talk about the parasympathetic nervous system. And this is our rest and digest nervous system. So this is going to be acting in opposition to the sympathetic nervous system. Things that we do here, we can use the acronym SLUD. SLUD stands for salivation, lagrimation, urination, and defecation. So here in the rest and digest system, where the responses that we'll typically receive is like a salivatory response. Lagrimation means tears, so we can also have urination. Urination is controlled by the parasympathetic nervous system, and also defecation, so just moving things through our GI tract. We are going to talk about one spot that we'll see all of the neurons in the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. This is going to be the vagus nerve. At the vagus nerve, we typically have all of our parasympathetic neurons going off from there. One more nervous system that I'll talk very briefly about is the enteric nervous system. In the enteric nervous system, this is going to have control of our GI tract. So it kind of works along with the parasympathetic nervous system. And yeah, so these are our nervous systems that are in the autonomic nervous system. Now, I'm going to erase that and let's talk about some specific, so these are the specific routes that can be taken in each of these nervous systems. These are just pathways that can be taken to get to places where neurotransmitters need to go to. I'm going to erase this and we'll talk about next another topic that's super important in the nervous system. Let's talk about specific neurotransmitters that are released in the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, and we'll talk about different receptors that are there as well. So this next part we'll be talking about neurotransmitters and receptors. So in the sympathetic nervous system, most of the sympathetic nervous system is going to consist of, like I said before, we always have a pre-ganglionic and post-ganglionic neuron. So I'm going to show that here. We're going to have a pre-ganglionic neuron that's myelinated, and a post-ganglionic neuron that is unmyelinated, and it's longer. So here, our preganglionic neuron releases something we call acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter. A neurotransmitter is just something that comes from a neuron, is released at the dendritic spines, the dendrites at the end of the neuron, where it's going to synapse with another neuron, and it will bind to a receptor on the post-ganglionic neuron. So here we have acetylcholine being released. That acetylcholine is going to travel over here to this post-ganglionic neuron, and it's going to bind to a receptor that's found there. This receptor, we're going to call it an N2 receptor. This is a nicotinic receptor. So nicotinic receptors bind acetylcholine. Another type of receptor that binds acetylcholine is muscarinic. Muscarinic receptors do that as well. So, acetylcholine released here. Nicotinic receptor. This nicotinic receptor is what we call an inotropic receptor. Inotropic receptors, like we've already discussed before, open a ligand-gated channel for the ions or neurotransmitters to flow through. So we open up that channel, we create an action potential, it goes down, and out here we're going to release another type of neurotransmitter. This neurotransmitter is specifically norepinephrine. So, really quickly, before I go on, let me just classify two types of neurotransmitters that we typically see. We can see something that we call catecholamines. Catecholamines consist of norepinephrine, epinephrine, and dopamine. This is a class of neurotransmitters that bind specifically to something that we call adrenergic receptors. That's a hard word to say, sorry. Adrenergic receptors. These adrenergic receptors are found at the postsynaptic, where the postsynaptic neuron will release its norepinephrine. So the types of adrenergic receptors we have are alpha 1 receptors, alpha 2 receptors, beta 1, beta 2, beta 3 receptors. We have D1 and D2 receptors. Here in a minute, we'll talk about what those do. But these receptors are found in some very specific locations. They will be found at localized sweat glands. So at our localized sweat glands, these sweat glands are like in the palms of our hands, in our armpits, in our groin, just areas where we typically sweat a lot. And so they are found in our localized sweat glands. They're also found in cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. Smooth muscle is muscle that is not skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle is voluntarily controlled, smooth muscle is not voluntarily controlled. So that is the first type of chemical signal that can be released in the sympathetic nervous system. A second type that we're going to talk about now is this is like most of the time, this is the type of sympathetic neurotransmitters that we'll be seeing released at specific places. So those specific places. But there's an exception. If we want to go to the general sweat glands, we have to take another type of path, and I'll talk about that right now. And we have to release different chemicals for that to happen. So first, we'll have the same acetylcholine released from our preganglionic neuron. After that, we'll have our N2 receptor, which is our nicotinic receptor. Acetylcholine will bind to it, cause an action potential. And after we have acetylcholine binding to our N2 receptors, we are going to go to general sweat glands. So our general sweat glands are sweat glands that aren't in our hands, palm of our hands, or soles of our feet, armpits, or groin. This is like areas in our belly, foreheads, legs, just the other sweat glands located throughout our body. And here we'll have acetylcholine released at this postsynaptic neuron, and we're going to bind to different muscarinic receptors. Talk about the specific of these, but muscarinic receptors bind acetylcholine, and there's 5 types of them. So we'll keep moving here and talk about the very last type of sympathetic neurotransmitter that can be released. And so we talked about these 2 different types. There's one more, like I said before, the pathway that goes to the adrenal medulla. It's a little bit different than the rest. So here we're going to have myelinated neuron, preganglionic neuron. And this travels to our adrenal medulla again. So remember, the adrenal medulla sits on top of the kidney. In the adrenal medulla, we have, like I said before, these little cells that act like neurons, very, very short, and they release chemicals into the bloodstream. So the first chemical that is released here is what we call acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is released in many spots in your body. Acetylcholine is going to bind to a specific receptor. That's another N2 receptor that's found in the cells of adrenal medulla. And lastly, in this type of receptor / release of neurotransmitters, we're going to release into the bloodstream the neurotransmitter epinephrine. Epinephrine is a type of catecholamine. This can travel through the bloodstream and bind to our adrenergic receptors found in other areas of our body. So that is a sympathetic nervous system. Let's talk about the parasympathetic nervous system, and then I'm going to talk about the specific receptor types and what happens in each, and then we'll wrap it up by talking about organs. So that was our parasympathetic nervous system, and the types of neurotransmitters that are released in it, and the types of receptors we can find in the sympathetic nervous system. Now let's talk about the parasympathetic nervous system. So in our parasympathetic nervous system, we only have one type of receptor, one type of release and receptor system. So always start with a preganglionic neuron that's myelinated. We'll have our postganglionic neuron as well. Here, the preganglionic neuron, if you notice a pattern, it releases acetylcholine. That's true for all of our preganglionic neurons. And the postganglionic neuron has an N2 receptor, also true of all our postganglionic neurons. So acetylcholine binds to the N2 receptor, the nicotinic receptor. That sends a signal down, and we're going to release a type of neurotransmitter down here. This is also going to be acetylcholine. And over here, we're going to have our muscarinic receptors. So M1 through M5. And over here, in our muscarinic receptors, this is going to bind to, so like I said before, the parasympathetic nervous system works against, in opposition to the sympathetic nervous system. So it's going to bind to the similar organs in places like glands and other areas where the sympathetic nervous system went, but it's just going to have a different response than the sympathetic nervous system did. So the parasympathetic nervous system goes out to just all glands, so like sweat glands specifically. It's going to go out to our cardiac muscle and our smooth muscle as well. So this is very similar to where we could find adrenergic receptors in the sympathetic nervous system, but here in the parasympathetic nervous system, it's going to elicit a different response, and those responses are coming from muscarinic receptors. So now we can talk about some organs that are very specific and with these things. But before we do that, I'm just going to give a brief explanation of what's happening in our adrenergic and muscarinic receptors. So, in our adrenergic receptors, let me explain those first. So our adrenergic receptors are alpha 1, alpha 2, beta 1, beta 2, beta 3, D1, and D2 receptors. These adrenergic receptors specifically bind catecholamines, which is our norepinephrine, epinephrine, and dopamine. So, in your alpha-1 receptor, when neurotransmitter binds a catecholamine, the very first thing that's going to happen is our G protein is activated. So that's actually going to be the very first step in all of these receptors. So just to demonstrate that, I'm going to put these little marks to mean same thing is happening. The very first response in adrenergic receptors, the G protein is activated. When we're talking about G proteins, we have a couple of different responses that happen after that. So a G protein is activated, and this can either, in this case, activate our IP3 pathway or a cyclic AMP pathway in our body. These are concepts that are learned in other cell and molecular biology classes, but we'll talk about the very basics of them here today. So the IP3 pathway is activated in our alpha receptors, and when we have the IP3 pathway activated, we're going to have an excitatory response. So EPSP, which is an excitatory postsynaptic potential. And our alpha receptors are going to bind better to norepinephrine than they do to epinephrine. So they prefer that norepinephrine's there. Next up, our alpha 2 receptor is going to activate the cyclic AMP pathway. And we're going to, I failed to mention up here, the IP3 pathway, we're going to increase that. In our cyclic AMP pathway, we actually decrease it in our alpha 2 receptor. So cyclic AMP is decreased. When that's decreased, this elicits an inhibitory postsynaptic potential. IPSP stands for inhibitory postsynaptic potential. And this also is going to prefer norepinephrine over epinephrine. So norepinephrine binds better to alpha 1 and alpha 2 receptors. Next, let's talk about our beta receptors. So in each case of our beta receptors, we're going to increase cyclic AMP. So the G protein is activated, and that helps to increase cyclic AMP in each of these cases. But it's going to elicit different responses in each of the cases. For our beta 1 receptors, it's going to elicit an excitatory postsynaptic potential. Beta 2 receptors, it elicits an inhibitory postsynaptic potential. And in our beta 3 receptor, it elicits an excitatory postsynaptic potential. Quickly, let's talk about what type of catecholamines bind better to each of these. So for our beta 1 receptors, epinephrine and norepinephrine bind equally to them. Our beta 2 receptors prefer to bind to epinephrine over norepinephrine. So they bind stronger to epinephrine. Our beta 3 receptors, we are going to bind strongly to norepinephrine as opposed to epinephrine. All right, we're almost there. We're down to our D1 and D2 receptors. D1 receptor increases the amount of CAMP from our G protein. The D2 receptor decreases the amount of CAMP. So that leads to an excitatory postsynaptic potential when CAMP is increased in the D1 receptor. When CAMP is decreased in the D2 receptor, that leads to an inhibitory postsynaptic potential. Now let's talk about the drugs that these prefer. Both of these are going to bind the best to dopamine. All right. Those are adrenergic receptors. Now, I'm going to talk about our muscarinic receptors. Our adrenergic receptors are found only in the sympathetic nervous system. So, only sympathetic nervous system adrenergic receptors, only found there. In our parasympathetic nervous system, we can find muscarinic receptors, and also in our sympathetic nervous system, we can find muscarinic receptors. So, muscarinic receptors are found in both. The muscarinic receptors are M1, M2, M3, M4, and M5. Let's talk about these. So M1, so each of these cases, the very first thing that happens when these receptors are hit is G proteins are affected. Once we affect our G protein, so that's the first step in each of these, right? We're going to elicit a response. When our G protein is affected, in the muscarinic 1 receptor, we're going to increase IP3. Muscarinic 2, we decrease CAMP. Our muscarinic 3, we're going to increase IP3. In our muscarinic 4, we decrease CAMP. And last but not least, in our muscarinic 5, we increase IP3. So a general trend that you can memorize is in all of our odd labeled muscarinic receptors, so M1, M3, and M5, we increase IP3. In our even numbered muscarinic receptors, we are going to, M2 and M4, we decrease CAMP in both scenarios. And another trend you can memorize is odd numbers always lead to an excitatory postsynaptic potential. So our M1, M3, and our M5 muscarinic receptors lead to an excitatory postsynaptic potential. Our M2 and our M4 receptors, muscarinic receptors, lead to an inhibitory postsynaptic potential. So all odds, even adrenergic receptors, lead to an excitatory postsynaptic potential. All the even labeled receptors will always lead to an inhibitory postsynaptic potential. It's just something to remember. And last but not least, all of these muscarinic receptors are what we call, these are all going to bind to acetylcholine the best. One thing I failed to mention is that acetylcholine, if neurotransmitters are releasing it and binding that, so if our neurons release acetylcholine, we call that a cholinergic neuron. And receptors that bind acetylcholine are cholinergic, while those that release are catecholamines, we call those ones. I'm blanking on the word that's opposite to that. We have a cholinergic versus our adrenergic receptors. Yeah. So cholinergic receptors bind to acetylcholine. That's all our muscarinic receptors. Also our N2 receptor that we talked about earlier. Adrenergic receptors bind catecholamines. One last point I want to make with this is different organs have different receptors on them. So we're just going to quickly review a couple of those organs. So in our eyes, the eye has two muscles. We have an outer and an inner muscle. The outer muscle, we have alpha-1 receptors. In the inner muscle, we have muscarinic 3 receptors. Yeah, and so alpha-1, if we if we target that receptor, then we're going to have dilation of the pupil. If we target the M3 receptor, we have constriction of the pupil. So this is really important for drugs in knowing what you want to target and what in response to like what will happen when you target these organs and the receptors. This is good stuff to know. In our heart, we're going to have two different types of receptors. We're going to have beta 1 and M2 receptors. In our beta 1 receptor, this is going to increase our heart rate. So beta 1 increases heart rate, muscarinic 2 decreases our heart rate. And as you can see, a lot of these have to do with sympathetic versus parasympathetic responses. So dilation is a sympathetic response, constriction here is a parasympathetic response. Here we have our sympathetic response is an increase in heart rate, decrease in heart rate is parasympathetic. So that's another connection you can be making as we're going through these things. In the lungs, we're going to have beta 2 receptors and M1 receptors. So our beta 2 receptors, they're kind of weird. Remember how they increased camp, but they led to an inhibitory response? For our lungs, if we want to dilate our lungs, we don't want to be constricting the muscles there. So for a sympathetic response, if we want to be running away from that bear like I was talking about and it's chasing you, you want to increase the amount of air and oxygen that's going through your lungs. You don't want to be decreasing that and constricting it. So what's going to happen is our beta 2 receptors are going to lead to a dilation or an expansion of the lungs so you can increase your capability to take in air. While an M1 receptor would lead to constriction of the lungs. So people with like asthma, people who have a hard time with breathing, you don't want to be activating their M1 receptors. That could worsen the problem they're already having. You want to be able to dilate their lungs, so you look for drugs that can help do that. Activate those beta 2 receptors. Two more organs I want to talk about. Let's talk about the blood vessels. The blood vessels will never have a parasympathetic response. They never have a parasympathetic response. They only respond to the sympathetic nervous system. In our blood vessels, we have alpha 1 receptors. Those alpha 1 receptors lead to a constriction of the blood vessel. So we're going to constrict those blood vessels, make them tighter so that we can increase our heart rates. And that's a sympathetic nervous system response. Increasing blood pressure, right? Sympathetic nervous system response. And lastly, we have our sweat glands. Sweat glands have alpha 1 receptors, and then M1 through M5 receptors. Our alpha 1 receptors target our localized sweat glands. So this is going to be in your armpits, your hands, your feet, your groin. Localized sweat glands are here. Alpha 1 receptors are in localized sweat glands. And M1 through M5 are going to be targeting those general sweat glands. And so in our alpha 1 receptor, this is purely sympathetic nervous system response, while we have our M1 through M5, this can be either parasympathetic nervous system or sympathetic nervous system. So alpha 1, only sympathetic nervous system. M1 through M5 can be either a sympathetic nervous system response or a parasympathetic nervous system response. And so I know this was a lot of content, but this is our autonomic nervous system. Important to understand a lot of these concepts because they'll help us to enhance our knowledge of what we should do with certain medicines in certain medical situations. And yeah, thank you guys for watching.